The moment I stopped trying to keep her happy, everything changed. Not immediately, not dramatically, but irreversibly. What I'm about to say will sound wrong to most men. It will sound cold, manipulative, even dangerous. But it isn't a trick. It's a mechanism. One that's been quietly shaping relationships long before either of us had language for it. Women don't miss men because they leave for a few days. They don't feel absence because of silence over a weekend. What actually happens is slower, biological, predictable, and deeply uncomfortable for the man who initiates it. When I created distance, real distance, not anger or punishment, a sequence began. 5 distinct phases. Each one tested my resolve. Each one tempted me to collapse back into who I used to be. And most men do. Almost all of them fail in the very first phase without realizing they were supposed to endure it. This isn't about cruelty. It's about restoring something that was lost when I became too available, too agreeable, too easy to keep. Before we go further, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. And if this kind of clarity matters to you, subscribe calmly, intentionally. I need to be precise here because most men misunderstand this part, and that misunderstanding is what destroys the outcome before it ever has a chance to work. Distancing is not withdrawal driven by resentment. It is not silence as punishment. It is not emotional starvation used to force obedience. When men attempt it from that place, they fail quickly and decisively. What they are actually doing is reacting, not leading. And reaction is weakness, no matter how it's dressed up. What makes distancing effective has nothing to do with tactics and everything to do with how the human brain categorizes value. There is a fundamental distinction the mind makes between what is essential and what is precious. Oxygen is essential. So is water. But because they are guaranteed, we don't wake up every morning feeling awe toward them. They are necessary, but invisible. They only become noticeable when they're threatened or removed. Human beings are processed the same way. When I was constantly available, constantly responsive, constantly adjusting myself to her moods, my presence became infrastructure. Reliable, predictable, assumed. I wasn't chosen anymore. I was expected. And expectation kills desire faster than conflict ever could. Most men believe the opposite. They believe that love is proven through availability, through sacrifice, through making yourself smaller so the relationship feels smoother. That belief is reinforced everywhere. Movies, advice columns, therapy language stripped of context. Be present, be supportive, be understanding, be patient. What no one explains is the cost of doing all of that without boundaries. When a man has no edge to him, no autonomy, no internal gravity of his own, the relationship loses polarity. And without polarity, there is no attraction. Only management. Only logistics. Only quiet resentment. This is where biology enters the picture, whether people like it or not. The brain evolved to track scarcity, not because of manipulation, but because survival depended on it. Anything abundant is categorized as safe but unremarkable. Anything that can be lost is monitored closely. This isn't conscious. It doesn't require intention. It happens automatically beneath thought. When I removed constant access to myself, something in her nervous system had to recalibrate. Not immediately. At first, it rejected the change. But eventually, it noticed the absence. And absence does something presence never can. It creates contrast. Contrast forces evaluation. As long as I was always there, she never had to evaluate me. I was a fixed constant in her environment, like furniture, useful, familiar, emotionally neutral. The moment I became less predictable, her brain had to reassess my value. Not because I demanded it, but because the system requires updating when conditions change. This is why distancing feels so counterintuitive. It goes against the training most men receive. We're taught that consistency builds security, and security builds love. But that's only half the equation. Security without mystery becomes complacency. Stability without autonomy becomes entitlement. And entitlement is the silent poison that kills respect. What most men also fail to understand is that distancing only works when it is grounded in reality, not in performance, not in bluffing. If the distance is fake, if it's driven by the hope of a reaction, it collapses under pressure. Because eventually she senses the need behind it. And need is what destroyed the dynamic in the first place. When I created distance, I didn't announce it. I didn't explain it. I didn't justify it. I simply stopped over-functioning in the relationship. I stopped filling every silence. I stopped rushing to respond. I stopped making her emotional state my responsibility. Not because I was angry, but because I realized I'd slowly abandoned myself. This is where the reset begins. Most relationships don't implode because of one big betrayal. They erode because one person becomes the emotional center and the other becomes a satellite, orbiting, adjusting, reacting. Over time, the satellite loses mass. It loses identity, and eventually it loses respect. Distancing breaks that orbit. It forces both people to confront something uncomfortable. For her, it raises uncertainty. For me, it raises fear. Fear of loss, fear of conflict, fear of being seen as selfish. Those fears are exactly why most men never do this correctly. They cave the moment discomfort appears. But discomfort is not a signal to stop. It's a signal that the old pattern is being challenged. This is also why timing matters so much. Most men attempt distancing after a major fight when emotions are already volatile, when threats have been spoken, when trust is already fractured. That's not distancing. That's abandonment disguised as strategy. And it usually accelerates the collapse. The ideal moment to create distance is when things look calm on the surface but feel stagnant underneath. When respect has quietly declined, but the relationship hasn't entered open crisis. When routines have replaced desire. When peace exists, but vitality does not. At that stage, distance feels confusing rather than threatening, subtle rather than hostile. And subtlety is essential. Too much distance creates relief instead of longing. Too little distance changes nothing. The goal is not to disappear. The goal is to become less accessible than she assumed you were. That assumption is everything. Because once someone assumes your presence is guaranteed, they stop choosing you. They start managing you. And management is the opposite of attraction. This is where men often accuse this concept of being manipulative. But manipulation requires deceit. This requires honesty. Brutal honesty about how you've been showing up. About how much of yourself you've been trading for harmony. About how often you've silenced your own direction to avoid friction. Distancing doesn't manufacture scarcity. It reveals how much scarcity was already missing. And here is the part no one wants to hear. If creating distance causes her to feel relieved rather than unsettled, the relationship was already dying. The distance didn't kill it. It exposed it. That truth is what makes this so hard. Because distancing is not a guarantee of reconciliation. It's a test of reality. It asks a simple, unforgiving question. Was she choosing you, or was she simply accustomed to you? Most men would rather not know the answer. So they stay available. They stay agreeable. They stay present long past the point where presence has any value. I stayed that way too, for a long time, until I realized that the cost of constant availability was the slow erosion of everything that made me a man worth choosing in the first place. And once that erosion stops, once distance introduces contrast, again the first emotional response is never longing. It's anger. Anger is always the first response. Not sadness, not fear, not longing. Anger. This is where men misinterpret everything and sabotage the process before it has a chance to do its work. They expect distance to make her soften, to make her reflective, to make her reach out gently and ask what's wrong. That expectation is fantasy. Reality is harsher. When I changed my behavior, she didn't think I might lose him. She thought, who does he think he is? That reaction is not personal. It's structural. When someone is accustomed to access any restriction, feels like an offense, not because they were mistreated, but because an unspoken agreement was violated. I had trained her nervous system to expect my availability. I had shown her over years that my time, attention, and emotional labor were on demand. When that stopped, the system reacted the way all systems do when supply is interrupted, with hostility. Anger is the nervous system's attempt to restore control. This is why the anger phase is so explosive for men who are already on thin ice. If the relationship still has what I call a margin of safety, no recent betrayals, no unresolved blow-ups, the anger often stays internal. She withdraws. She becomes cold. She grows sharp and dismissive. She processes privately. But if that margin is gone, if resentment has been building, the anger becomes external. Loud, dramatic, threatening. This is where ultimatums appear. This is where bags get packed. This is where parents get called and friends get involved. This is where social media suddenly fills with vague declarations about self-worth and boundaries. Men panic here. They mistake intensity for finality. They hear the word divorce and assume the house is already on fire. So they rush in to put it out. They apologize for things they didn't do. They promise changes they can't sustain. They collapse back into availability to restore peace. And in doing so, they fail the most important test of the entire process. Because anger is not the end. It's the gate. Anger exists to see whether pressure works, not consciously, biologically. When I reconciled too quickly in the past, I taught her something without ever saying it out loud. I taught her that escalation gets results, that discomfort forces compliance, that my frame collapses under emotional weight. Each time that happens, something erodes in her perception, not affection, respect. And respect, once lost, does not regenerate through kindness. Men want to believe that reassurance heals anger. It doesn't. Reassurance given under pressure communicates weakness. It says, I can be moved. It says, your emotions dictate my position. And once that message is received, it becomes part of the relational architecture. This is why men who cave during the anger phase often notice a strange shift afterward. The conflict resolves, but the relationship doesn't improve. If anything, the behavior they feared increases. More tests, more volatility, more emotional demands. Because the nervous system learned something valuable. It learned the lever works. Women don't test strength because they enjoy conflict. They test it because safety requires it. Not safety in the moral sense. Safety in the biological one. A man who collapses under pressure is unpredictable long-term. His agreement is not rooted in choice. It's rooted in fear. And fear cannot anchor desire. When I maintained distance through her anger, something unexpected happened. The external focus began to turn inward, not immediately, but inevitably. Anger cannot sustain itself without reinforcement. It requires resistance. It needs an opponent. When I didn't argue, didn't justify, didn't chase, the anger lost its target. And without a target, it had to evolve. This is the moment most men never see. When the anger has nowhere to land, it transforms. It becomes doubt. Not doubt about the relationship. Doubt about assumptions. Why isn't this working? Why isn't he reacting? Why doesn't this feel like control anymore? And then quietly, the internal questions begin. Have I been pushing too hard? Have I taken him for granted? What changed? This internalization is impossible while a man remains constantly accessible. Availability gives anger a surface to strike. Distance removes it. That is why anger is necessary. It burns away entitlement. Most men are so afraid of being seen as cold or cruel that they never allow this phase to complete. They interrupt it. They rescue her from her own discomfort. And in doing so, they rescue the old dynamic. I want to be very clear about something here. Maintaining distance through anger does not mean being silent and indifferent. It means staying calm, stable, unreactive. When she accused me of changing, I didn't deny it. When she demanded explanations, I didn't debate them. When she escalated emotionally, I didn't match her energy. I stayed grounded in one truth. I was no longer organizing my behavior around preventing her displeasure. That alone felt like rebellion. Anger is also where most men reveal their real motivation. If the distance is being used to get something attention apology pursued, it collapses here. Because anger makes the reward uncertain, and uncertainty exposes need. A man who needs a specific outcome cannot tolerate prolonged hostility. He will trade his frame for relief every time. Only a man who is grounded in his own direction can hold steady without demanding resolution. This is why so many men describe distancing as unbearable. Not because it's cruel, but because it removes their primary source of validation. They've been measuring their worth through her mood for so long that anger feels like annihilation. I felt that too. Every instinct screamed at me to fix it, to restore harmony, to be the good husband again. But I had to confront an uncomfortable truth. The harmony I was protecting was already killing the relationship. It just wasn't loud enough yet to be called a problem. Anger is loud. That's why it feels dangerous. But it's also honest. It reveals exactly how much control had crept into the dynamic, how much emotional leverage had accumulated over time. When that leverage stops working, it gets used harder. It's not malice. It's habit. If you survive this phase without collapsing, something crucial shifts. She realizes she cannot move you through volatility. She realizes the old buttons no longer function. She realizes the man she thought she had figured out is no longer predictable. That realization is the seed of attraction. Not comfort, not security. Attraction. But this only happens if you do not flinch. The anger phase does not reward bravery with warmth. It rewards endurance with silence. And silence is where the next phase begins. Because when anger exhausts itself, it leaves behind something far more dangerous. Space. When the anger finally burns itself out, what remains is not peace. It's uncertainty. And uncertainty is far more destabilizing than conflict. This is the point where most men misread the situation again. They interpret the reduction in hostility as progress. They think, good, it's cooling down. Now I can move back in. That instinct is understandable. It's also destructive. Because the absence of anger does not mean the dynamic has reset. It means the old tools stopped working. What happens internally at this stage is subtle but profound. Without the noise of confrontation, she begins to notice the vacuum. Not your absence in a dramatic sense, but the missing pressure of your attention. The constant emotional reinforcement you used to provide is no longer there. The relationship feels quieter, less managed, less predictable. And predictability is what once made her feel secure. This is where fear begins to replace anger. Not overt fear, quiet fear. The kind that doesn't announce itself, but changes behavior. She starts replaying moments. She remembers how things used to feel. She compares the present silence to the former certainty. But pride prevents immediate outreach. This is the transition phase, the most deceptive phase. Because externally, it looks like nothing is happening. Internally, everything is being recalculated. The mind cannot tolerate unresolved uncertainty for long. It needs explanation, and when external explanations are unavailable, it turns inward. This is when self-questioning begins. Did I push too hard? Was I fair? Why isn't he chasing like before? These questions are not about guilt. They are about control, about lost leverage. As long as you were always available, control was invisible. It didn't need to be exercised consciously. It was embedded in the routine, in the expectation that you would respond, adjust, repair. Now that expectation has been violated, and violation forces reassessment. Men often sabotage this phase because it feels empty. There is no reassurance, no feedback, no clear signal of success. They feel invisible, and invisibility triggers panic. That panic drives them back into old behaviors. Extra kindness, unprompted gestures, emotional explanations, attempts to clarify intentions. All of it communicates the same thing. I need resolution more than you do. The moment that message is sent, the balance tilts back, the uncertainty collapses. Control returns to its former place. This phase only works if you tolerate being misunderstood. She may interpret your distance as selfishness, or avoidance, or even cruelty. You cannot correct that interpretation without destroying the process. Clarification here is not leadership, it's defense. Leadership requires allowing people to form their own conclusions. The transition phase also exposes something men rarely want to confront: the difference between connection and dependency. When connection exists, distance creates longing. When dependency exists, distance creates anxiety. Anxiety demands relief, and relief is often found through replacement. This is why distancing does not work universally. Not all women respond to distance with reflection. Some respond with substitution. And this is where discernment becomes critical. There are fundamentally two orientations toward relationships. One orientation values construction, stability, continuity, the slow accumulation of shared meaning. These women experience distance as disruption, something to be understood and repaired. The other orientation values stimulation, attention, novelty, emotional peaks. These women experience distance as opportunity, a gap to be filled. This distinction is not moral, it is structural. A woman who is driven by constant validation does not sit with absence. She replaces it, quickly, efficiently, without sentimentality. If your partner has a long history of seeking attention, externally maintaining open channels to past partners, or broadcasting her desirability publicly, distance will not make her reflective. It will activate her search behavior. Men often learn this lesson the hard way. I did. I once believed that pulling back would cause her to notice the imbalance, that she would step forward to meet me. Instead, she stepped sideways, toward attention, toward novelty, toward familiar validation. At first, there was silence. Then, activity. Increased presence online, carefully framed happiness, signals designed to be seen. By the time I realized what was happening, the truth was unavoidable. I was attempting to increase my value to someone who did not value depth. Distance did not make her miss me. It revealed her orientation. That revelation was painful, but it was honest. Distancing is not a guarantee of reconciliation. It is a filter. It separates relationships built on shared construction from those built on constant consumption. When a woman has the capacity for deep bonding, the transition phase becomes introspective. She weighs the relationship against alternatives. She feels the absence as loss, not liberation. But even then, she does not rush back. Pride holds her in place. Habit resists change. She waits. This waiting is strategic, even if unconscious. She is observing, measuring, watching to see if the distance is stable or reactive. If you break here, if you reach out to relieve your own discomfort, you confirm that the distance was never real. Just another mood, another attempt to influence her response. Consistency is the test, not intensity, not declarations. Consistency. This is also where many men overdose on distance. They mistake silence for strength and become cold, withdrawn, unavailable to the point of emotional absence. That does not create attraction. It creates alienation. Distance must be measured. You remain polite. You remain composed. You remain engaged when engaged. But you are no longer on standby. Your life continues independently, without performance, without signaling. You respond when it makes sense, not when anxiety demands it. This balance is difficult. It requires restraint most men have never practiced, because restraint offers no immediate reward. The reward comes later, and it comes in the form of movement. When the internal questioning becomes too loud, she reaches out, not to reconcile, not to apologize, to test. The first reach out never looks like what men imagine. It isn't an apology. It isn't a confession of missing you. It isn't vulnerability. It's trivial. A question about something unimportant. A comment about logistics. A forwarded meme. An observation with no emotional weight attached. On the surface, it looks meaningless. That is why so many men mishandle it. This is the third phase, the probing phase, the moment where she tests the temperature of the space between you. She's not reaching out to reconnect. She's checking whether the distance is still there. Most men are starving by this point. Weeks of silence restrain self-control. Their nervous system is exhausted. When that first message arrives, it feels like relief, validation, proof that the strategy worked, and they destroy everything in one response. They reply too fast. They reply too warmly. They over-explain. They reinsert emotional availability immediately. In a single moment, the entire structure collapses, because the question she was asking was never verbal. It was implicit. Is he still centered, or was that distance just a phase when a man lunges forward at the first sign of contact? He answers that question clearly. He tells her the distance was temporary, that he was waiting, that his frame was conditional. And once she knows that there is no reason to pursue further, the reach-out phase is not about what she says. It's about how you respond. The correct response is neutral warmth. Polite, grounded, unhurried. You don't ignore her. You don't interrogate her. You don't reward the contact with emotional intensity. You respond like a man who has options, not romantic options. Life options. This is where most men confuse detachment with hostility. They think holding frame means being cold. It doesn't. It means being non-reactive. You answer the question. You acknowledge the contact. You do not expand the interaction. And then you return to your life. This creates friction in her expectations because she expected one of two outcomes, either rejection or collapse. When neither happens, curiosity intensifies. Curiosity is far more powerful than reassurance. At this stage, she begins to test again. Slightly more engagement, slightly more personal, still indirect. She may ask about your schedule. She may reference shared memories. She may create reasons to be physically present. These are not reconnections. They are calibrations. Men who fail here usually fail for one reason. They want certainty. They want to know where they stand. They want clarity. They want confirmation that the relationship is safe again. But safety is not what creates desire. Safety is what follows desire. If you try to force certainty before attraction has re-emerged, you short-circuit the process. This is where the fourth phase begins. Provocation. Provocation is not random. It is intentional testing of boundaries. Sometimes it looks positive. Sometimes it looks negative. Positive provocations include sudden warmth, affection, sexual availability, acts of service. She may dress differently, touch you more, initiate intimacy she had withheld before. Men misinterpret this as resolution. It isn't. It's a test of consistency. She wants to see if access to your body restores access to your frame, if desire gives her leverage again. Negative provocations are more obvious, but just as dangerous. Mentions of other men, casual references to attention she's receiving, subtle jealousy plays, picking fights over minor issues. These are not cruelty. They are information gathering. She's asking one question in different forms. Can I still move him emotionally? If you become jealous, you fail. If you become defensive, you fail. If you become overly pleased, you fail. Any strong reaction tells her the distance was fragile. This phase is where even disciplined men stumble, because the provocations target the ego. Sexual interest tempts need, jealousy tempts insecurity, conflict tempts reactivity. The correct response is what I call warm neutrality. You enjoy what is offered without chasing it. You acknowledge provocations without reacting to them. You remain present without becoming possessed. This is extraordinarily difficult because it requires you to feel without acting. Most men have never practiced that. I watched a close friend navigate this with his wife of over a decade. Their marriage had degraded into something functional but lifeless. No polarity, no spark, just schedules and irritation. He didn't announce a strategy. He didn't threaten change. He simply stopped being constantly available. He focused on his work, his health, his friendships. He became less responsive without becoming distant, less eager without becoming cold. The first month was brutal. Accusations, suspicion, emotional volatility. He held steady. The second month, the tone shifted. She cooked his favorite meals, initiated sex, then tested him by mentioning a coworker who showed interest, suggested they rethink their arrangement. He didn't bite, not in either direction. He accepted intimacy without worshiping it. He acknowledged the provocation without defending against it. By the third month, the dynamic had inverted. She was pursuing, not aggressively, not desperately, intentionally. But here's the crucial detail. The distance he created was almost imperceptible. He didn't vanish. He didn't stonewall. He didn't punish. He simply stopped organizing his life around her emotional state. This is where men misunderstand dosage. Distance is medicine. Too little does nothing. Too much kills the patient. If you announce your distance, it becomes a power struggle. If you withdraw completely, it becomes abandonment. The correct dose creates ambiguity. She should question whether something has changed without being able to point to a specific action. That uncertainty keeps her engaged without feeling rejected. Timing matters just as much as dosage. Most men wait until after explosive conflict to create distance. By then, emotions are already detached. Distance feels like relief, not loss. The optimal moment is before crisis, when respect has eroded quietly, when the relationship feels flat but intact. Distance introduced at that stage disrupts complacency without triggering escape. And here is the part no one prepares men for. You must maintain this posture even when she starts pursuing. That is the real test. Men think the challenge is surviving anger. It isn't. The challenge is not collapsing when validation returns. The moment she softens most, men rush to restore the old dynamic. Full availability, full access, full emotional transparency, and the cycle restarts. The correct response to pursuit is not rejection. It is pacing. You allow closeness to increase slowly. You maintain independent rhythms. You let attraction rebuild organically. You do not trade your autonomy for harmony again. Because the moment your presence becomes guaranteed, its value begins to decay. The final phase is genuine pursuit. Not testing, not provocation, real investment. But whether you ever reach it depends entirely on whether you can hold your frame when everything inside you wants relief. By the time genuine pursuit begins, the dynamic has already changed. Not visibly, structurally. This is the phase most men misunderstand the most because it looks like success while still being fragile. She is warmer, more attentive, more invested. But she is also watching carefully, measuring whether this version of you is stable or temporary. Real pursuit does not arrive loudly. It does not announce itself. It reveals itself through consistency. She initiates contact without pretext. She adjusts her schedule to yours. She becomes curious about your inner world again, not because you demanded it, because you stopped chasing it. But here is the danger. Many men believe this phase is the finish line. They relax. They celebrate internally. They let their guard down. They assume the work is done. That assumption is fatal. Because what she is responding to is not the distance itself. It is the man who emerged from it. If that man disappears, so does her attraction. This is where the concept of frame becomes non-negotiable. Frame is not dominance. Frame is not control. Frame is internal orientation. It is the position from which you act rather than react. The axis around which your decisions rotate. When your frame is strong, your actions are coherent. When it is weak, your behavior becomes responsive to external pressure. During the earlier phases, she was testing whether your frame could withstand discomfort. Now she is testing whether it can withstand comfort. Comfort is more dangerous than conflict. Conflict sharpens awareness. Comfort dulls it. As things improve, the temptation to revert is powerful. You want to enjoy the closeness. You want to make up for lost time. You want to prove you care. But proving care through availability is what collapsed the polarity in the first place. This is the paradox that breaks most men. The less you organize yourself around the question of whether she misses you, the more she feels compelled to invest. When your focus shifts from outcome to orientation, the distance becomes natural rather than strategic. You are not withholding. You are living. That distinction matters more than technique ever could. This is also where men ask the most dangerous question. What if she never misses me? The answer is uncomfortable, but it is honest. If distance does not produce reflection, curiosity, or pursuit over time, the relationship was already hollow. The bond existed in routine, not in desire. Distance did not destroy it. It removed the illusion, holding it together. Men resist this truth because it threatens their identity. They have often invested years into being the stabilizing force, the reliable one, the accommodating one. To discover that this investment did not generate attraction feels like betrayal. But attraction is not a reward for sacrifice. It is a response to polarity. This is why some relationships do not survive distancing, and why paradoxically distancing still succeeds in those cases. Because it forces the man to confront reality instead of negotiating with denial. In the most extreme cases where contempt has fully replaced respect, distance does not lead to pursuit. It leads to separation. But even then, the process serves a purpose. I have seen men maintain strategic distance not for weeks, but for years. Not to punish, not to manipulate, but to rebuild themselves. They stopped centering their lives around the relationship. They rebuilt physical strength. They advanced their careers. They cultivated male friendships. They developed interests that existed independently. Their wives noticed, of course. But by the time they did, the men had changed so profoundly that reconciliation would have required the woman to meet them at a higher level, not pull them back into the old dynamic. Some marriages were transformed, others ended. In both outcomes, the men were no longer diminished. This is where the narrative around distancing becomes distorted. People frame it as a strategy to make her miss you. That framing is incomplete. The real function of distancing is to restore your center of gravity. Modern men have been trained to orbit around emotions, around moods, around approval, around peacekeeping. Over time, this orbit erases them. They become emotional servants, constantly monitoring, constantly adjusting, constantly sacrificing their own direction to maintain equilibrium. Distancing breaks that orbit. It forces you to confront who you are without the role of appeaser, without the identity of good husband defined as self-erasure, without the constant feedback loop of her emotional state. That confrontation is terrifying. Because many men discover they don't know who they are outside the relationship. Their hobbies became shared obligations. Their friendships faded. Their decisions required permission, even if it was never explicitly asked for. I experienced this myself. When I created distance, I had to relearn how to be alone, how to make plans without considering her reaction, how to enjoy silence without interpreting it as danger, how to hold desire without acting on it. It felt like rehabilitation. Painful, slow, humbling. But something unexpected happened. As I became more self-contained, more deliberate, more grounded, she became more interested. Not because I was playing a game, but because the man she originally chose had returned. Not the version shaped by fear of loss, the version guided by purpose. This is the part no one emphasizes enough. Distancing only works when it is rooted in genuine independence. If it is performed as a tactic, it collapses under pressure. If it is lived as a posture, it endures. Women are exquisitely sensitive to incongruence. They may not articulate it, but they feel it. A man who is pretending to be independent will eventually reveal need. A man who has become independent no longer requires validation to maintain his position. That difference determines everything. During this phase, she may still test, less aggressively, more subtly. Emotional moments, manufactured crises, requests for reassurance disguised as vulnerability. These are not manipulations. They are checks. She's asking whether this stability exists only when things are calm, or whether it holds under emotional strain. If you rush to rescue every discomfort you teach her, that intensity restores access. If you remain supportive without surrendering your center, you teach her that connection does not require control. This recalibration takes time, and patience is the price. Men conditioned to instant results struggle here. They want to label the relationship fixed. They want guarantees. They want closure. But healthy dynamics are not closed systems. They are maintained. This is the final truth of strategic distancing. It is not something you do to her. It is something you stop doing to yourself. You stop abandoning your own direction for approval. You stop trading your autonomy for harmony. You stop needing reassurance to feel secure. Whether she chooses to step into that new dynamic is her decision. Your responsibility is to maintain it, because the moment you do something irreversible happens. You no longer fear being missed. You become someone who chooses, and that shift changes everything regardless of how the relationship ends. At this point, the conversation around distancing usually shifts from theory to fear. Not fear of losing her, but fear of what happens if you stop organizing your life around the relationship entirely. This is where most men hesitate, because distancing, when done correctly, forces a confrontation with identity. For years, I defined myself through usefulness, through reliability, through emotional availability. I told myself this was maturity, that this was what commitment looked like. But slowly, without noticing, I stopped making choices that had nothing to do with her. My hobbies became our hobbies. My friends became conditional. My plans required emotional clearance. None of this was demanded explicitly. That's what makes it dangerous. It happened through accommodation, through small compromises made in the name of peace. Distancing stripped that illusion away. Suddenly, I had time, silence, space, and no clear idea what to do with it. This is where many men sabotage themselves by filling the vacuum incorrectly. They replace availability to her with distractions, overwork, excessive gym routines, shallow social validation. None of that creates independence. It just numbs anxiety. Real independence requires direction. You don't distance to punish her. You distance to re-anchor yourself. That means choosing goals that exist regardless of her reaction. Pursuits that matter even if she never notices. Values that do not shift under emotional pressure. This phase is uncomfortable because it reveals how much of your behavior was reactive. How often you adjusted yourself to avoid displeasure. How rarely you acted from intention. As that awareness deepens, something changes in the way she perceives you. Not because she knows what you're doing, but because she feels the absence of need. Need is loud. It leaks through tone, timing, posture. When it disappears, the emotional environment changes. This is when she may attempt more sophisticated tests. Not overt provocations, subtle ones. Moments of vulnerability that invite you to overfunction. Requests framed as emotional emergencies. Confessions designed to pull reassurance out of you. These are not malicious. They are habitual. They are how connection used to be regulated. The difference now is that you no longer rush to stabilize her internal state. You listen. You acknowledge. You do not absorb responsibility. That boundary is invisible, but powerful. When men fail here, they fail quietly. They believe they are being supportive, but they are actually re-entering the orbit. reassuring too much, explaining too deeply, prioritizing harmony over alignment. Support without self-abandonment is the skill that separates transformation from relapse. This is also where the relationship either evolves or reveals its limits. Some women rise to the new dynamic. They adjust. They meet you with increased effort. They learn to regulate their own emotions instead of outsourcing that task to you. Others resist. They escalate crises. They accuse you of changing. They frame your independence as distance or neglect. They attempt to reassert control through guilt rather than anger. This is the moment of truth. If you collapse here, the entire process resets. If you hold steady, the relationship either restructures or dissolves. And this is where men ask a question they've avoided since the beginning. What if this ends? That question terrifies men who have built their identity around being chosen, around being needed, around being irreplaceable through sacrifice. But here is the truth distancing reveals. A relationship sustained by fear of loss is already lost. If the only thing keeping a woman with you is your willingness to disappear into her needs, that bond is not intimacy. It is dependency. Distancing exposes whether attraction exists beneath the accommodation. And if it doesn't, no amount of presence would have saved it. This realization is painful, but it is clarifying. Men who survive this phase emerge different, not hardened, not detached, clear. They stop negotiating their worth. They stop auditioning for affection. They stop mistaking endurance for love. This clarity is what women respond to, whether consciously or not. It communicates one message. I am here because I choose to be, not because I am afraid to leave. That message changes how every interaction is interpreted. Complaints lose leverage. Threats lose weight. Affection gains meaning because it is no longer taken for granted. This is also where men begin to understand something crucial. Distancing is not something you eventually stop doing. It becomes the baseline. Not distance as separation, but distance as autonomy. You maintain friendships she is not part of. You pursue goals that don't require her approval. You protect time that is not negotiable, not to provoke desire, but to preserve yourself. The men who fail long-term are the ones who treat distancing as a temporary intervention, a reset button after which they return to old patterns. Those patterns will always reassert themselves if the underlying identity remains unchanged. The men who succeed are the ones who let distancing permanently alter how they relate to themselves. They no longer center their emotional stability around the relationship. They no longer interpret her moods as directives. They no longer seek reassurance as proof of value. From that place, connection becomes a choice rather than a necessity. And that choice is what keeps attraction alive. Because attraction does not survive obligation. It survives tension, mystery, autonomy, the quiet knowledge that access must be earned, not assumed. By now, if you followed this progression, honestly, one thing should be clear. The hardest part of distancing was never her reaction. It was learning to tolerate your own. The discomfort of not being needed. The anxiety of not being certain. The fear of discovering that the relationship might not survive without your constant effort. Most men never face that fear. They anesthetize it with availability. But once you do face it, once you stop running from it, something stabilizes inside you. You realize that losing a relationship is survivable, that loneliness is temporary, that self-respect is non-negotiable. And from that realization, a different kind of strength emerges. Not performative, not aggressive, quiet. That strength is what carries you into the final phase. Because the last phase is not about whether she chooses you. It's about whether you would choose her now that you no longer need to. When you reach this stage, the question quietly flips. For a long time, everything revolved around whether she would come back, soften, pursue, or recommit. Now the pressure shifts inward. You begin to evaluate her through a different lens. Not emotionally, structurally. This is where most men feel disoriented because the dynamic they fought so hard to reset no longer feels familiar. The anxiety that once drove their behavior has faded. In its place is a calm awareness, and with it a dangerous clarity. You start noticing things you ignored before. How often she regulates her emotions through conflict. How frequently she externalizes responsibility. How comfortable she was with your self-erasure. These observations don't come from resentment. They come from distance. Distance does not only change how she sees you, it changes how you see the relationship. This is why strategic distancing is irreversible when done correctly. You cannot unsee what becomes visible once you are no longer emotionally submerged. During this phase, she may intensify her pursuit, not through tests now, but through consistency. She shows up differently, more respectful, more intentional, less reactive. She adjusts her behavior because she feels the shift is permanent. But permanence must be proven. This is where many men fail by prematurely restoring access. They interpret improvement as permission to return to old habits, full transparency, full availability, emotional merging. They tell themselves the lesson has been learned. What they miss is that the lesson was not for her. It was for them. If you reattach your sense of self to her behavior, the polarity collapses again. Slowly, quietly, but inevitably. This phase demands something most men were never taught. Selective investment. You don't withhold affection. You don't suppress desire. You don't perform indifference. You simply invest proportionally. You match effort without exceeding it. You engage without chasing. You connect without losing orientation. This balance is subtle and it requires discipline. Because the urge to overcorrect is strong, men who were once too available often swing too far in the other direction. They become distant, rigid, emotionally closed. That is not strength, it is armor. Armor repels intimacy. The goal is not to be unreachable, it is to be grounded. Grounded men do not rush. They do not explain themselves excessively. They do not seek reassurance. They allow space without creating absence. This is also where unresolved resentment can surface. Not hers, yours. As you regain your footing, you may feel anger about how much you gave, how long you tolerated imbalance, how invisible you felt. This anger is natural, but if you act from it, you poison the future. Distancing is not about revenge. It is about recalibration. If resentment drives your behavior now, you are still reactive, just in a different direction. This phase requires forgiveness without amnesia. You acknowledge what happened. You do not erase it. You integrate the lesson. Forgiveness allows forward movement. Amnesia guarantees repetition. This is also where some men realize the relationship no longer aligns with who they've become. Not because she is wrong, but because the dynamic requires more compromise than they are willing to make again. This realization is quiet. It does not arrive with drama. It arrives as certainty. And certainty changes everything. When a man knows he will be fine, regardless of outcome, his behavior stabilizes. He no longer negotiates under pressure. He no longer accepts dynamics that diminish him. This is when the woman senses something fundamental. She is no longer the axis of his world. She can be part of it. She can be valued within it. But she does not define it. That shift either deepens attraction or ends the relationship cleanly. Both outcomes are victories, because what you lose in one, you gain in the other. Men who reach this stage often fear that their calm means they no longer care. That is not true. Caring without attachment feels unfamiliar, but it is healthier. Attachment demands reassurance. Care allows freedom. This distinction is what most relationships never achieve. By now, the 5 phases have unfolded: anger, transition, reach out, provocation, pursuit. But these phases were never about her emotions. They were mirrors. Each one reflected a part of you that needed strengthening. Your tolerance for discomfort, your ability to remain grounded, your capacity to act without immediate reward. That is why the final phase is not dramatic. It is quiet. The relationship either stabilizes into a new equilibrium or it ends without chaos. No begging, no collapse, no self-betrayal, just choice. And choice is the foundation of respect. If the relationship continues, it does so with a new understanding. Your presence is not guaranteed. It is offered. Your commitment is not extracted. It is chosen. And if it ends with your dignity intact. You do not scramble to be understood. You do not perform growth for approval. You do not chase closure. You move forward with clarity. This is where men finally understand the paradox that governed the entire process. The moment you stopped trying to be missed, you became someone worth missing. Not because of strategy, not because of manipulation, but because you reclaimed your center. And a man with a center does not orbit. He stands. There is a point often reached quietly where the relationship no longer dictates your internal weather. You still care. You still notice. But you are no longer pulled off center by every shift in her mood. That is when the final testing begins. These tests are not dramatic.